If you weren't among the dwindling Sega fanbase during the 5th and 6th generation of gaming, then it's very possible to overlook how ahead of its time the Dreamcast really was upon release. Despite the console's abrupt cancellation in 2001 as Sega transitioned to third-party development, many games released during the short lifespan of the Dreamcast were not only ported to other consoles such as the GameCube and PS2 in the coming years, but were also among the best-selling or at least recognizably underrated titles for those consoles as well. These games included Resident Evil Code Veronica, Jet Set Radio, and of course, Sonic Adventure. Independent from its platforming roots, Sonic Adventure was conceived as an RPG-style game with emphasis on storytelling. Alongside this narrative-heavy experience, Sega decided early in development that they wanted extensive voice acting for the first time in Sonic history. Sega wanted to use the release of this title as an opportunity to show off the power of the new disc-based Dreamcast, much like Sonic did for the Genesis when he first appeared on the gaming scene. Development of Sonic Adventure was tied so closely with development of the Dreamcast itself that director Takashi Iizuka was able to request more RAM to be installed in the console just for the benefits of Sonic Team's development. Sonic Adventure was released first in Japan during the holiday season of 1998, just 1 month after Ocarina of Time and Metal Gear Solid reached Nintendo and Sony's hardware respectively. Sonic Adventure then reached Western Sega fans during September of '99, and effortlessly became the highest-selling game on the Dreamcast, with roughly 2.5 million copies sold before Sega bailed on the hardware scene. While the game sold well and received high review scores as well as multiple awards and nominations, critics still couldn't agree on which aspects were worthy of celebration and which should be condemned. It would seem that Sega made a lot of weird decisions during the development of Sonic Adventure, and while it surely hasn't aged well in juxtaposition to its contemporaries, there are still more than a handful of obviously impressive ideas that found their way into Sonic Adventure. I flipped back and forth over whether or not I really thought this game was that great, but it slowly grew on me the more I played, despite its flaws or oddities. I think the best way to thoroughly explore everything this game has to offer would be to explain both the accomplishments and pitfalls in the same order that a player could be expected to experience them. Hopefully, you'll have a better understanding of what this game looked like at release as we piece together what's so great about Sonic Adventure. Before we begin our adventure, we're shown that there are actually 6 playable characters, both returning and brand new to the franchise, though we can only begin as Sonic. The rest of the characters will be unlocked as players either meet them or even fight them in Sonic's campaign. This was quite an early example of experiencing the same storyline from multiple characters' points of view, all of whom featured different gameplay and unique events in the game's plot. Donkey Kong 64 had something similar going on with all the members of the DK crew, but they obviously didn't focus as much on the narrative through line. It's clear that players aren't experiencing the entire story of Sonic Adventure from Sonic's view alone, as characters disappear for several stages at a time and seem to have unique encounters with each other, as well as the antagonist, Eggman. These gaps actually incentivize the player into trying the other characters' campaigns in order to figure out how all of these paths manage to cross in the end. It's nice to actually have a story of some sense that ties together all of the diverse, wacky settings found in nearly every Sonic game. It was never at the forefront of the 2D Sonic experience unless you read through the manuals, but the mainline Sonic games do actually feature an interconnected plot, and the developers of Sonic Adventure gave fans a huge expansion in terms of the Sonic universe, with more expansive plot lines for both new and old characters. My only real complaint about the story is how childishly the majority of it is written. For example, why can Sonic and Tails, for the life of themselves, not hang on to any of the Chaos Emeralds? All of our protagonists feel incredibly naive, though at the same time they all have very clear and unique personalities. Much like the 2D entries, every playable character in this Sonic title has different means of navigating the world. Instead of a homing attack or spin dash, for instance, Tails can hover and strike enemies with his tails. Just as in the Genesis games in which he was featured, Knuckles can glide after jumping and climb vertical surfaces. The gliding is also remarkably smooth and free for this era. Love them or hate them, every character does feel like a substantially different way of experiencing the same game. This is an often overlooked opportunity whenever a game features multiple playable characters because, for instance, if done poorly, this game could have just felt like playing as Sonic 6 times in a row. Instead, you have characters who move differently, fight differently, and have their own unique objectives and points of view. Let's take a closer look at each character's design and contributions to the game's experience, starting of course with Sonic. This game is cartoonishly chaotic from the get-go, which I guess is in line with the fast and loose atmosphere that Sonic games so often strive for. The first piece of gameplay we get to experience is actually a boss fight with the new fluid-based Chaos enemy. During this fight, the player has the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the third-person camera, as well as Sonic's new homing attack. Chaos's design was influenced by the game's director wanting a villain that could not have been portrayed on older hardware, and two of the most obvious upgrades in this era of gaming were liquids and transparency. Speaking of character designs, Sonic and the rest of the gang were given substantial redesigns for this title in order to not only make them appear more mature, but also slimmer, due to the fact that transforming their Genesis sprites into 3D models produced short and oddly proportioned characters. For the majority of the first proper level, Emerald Coast, a player pretty much just has to hold forward, and the camera will position itself behind Sonic in a way that forces the player down the correct path. This isn't necessarily a negative point, however, as I've mentioned, the design of allowing the player to simply hold right on the classic Genesis games also allowed new and unfamiliar players to experience the general features that a Sonic level had to offer. There's no doubt that Sega was pursuing a similar format here, as the level designs actually become more interesting after opening with a few levels that are only meant to show off the power of Sega's newest console. Sonic does still control well, it's just that he moves so quickly and so sharply that every movement feels disconnected, and for lack of a better term, chunky. With how quickly Sonic is thrown around some of these stages, especially the second action stage, Wind Valley, it's impossible to know how you're even expected to be controlling him. The various boosters, bumpers, and wind currents whip the player in every direction with little input, yet will also sometimes send Sonic off of the narrow, winding pathways if something doesn't quite line up. The platforming and movement in this game just doesn't feel as engaging as previous entries in the series. For instance, Sonic still has his staple spin dash move, but it's never really utilized. It makes him move too fast in the free roaming areas, and there's never really a need to stop and gain speed for the fast third-person hallway segments, because momentum isn't integrated as meticulously as it was in the two-dimensional Sonic titles. However, that is a very high standard to meet, as the original Sonic games are often cited as some of the most impressively designed 2D platformers of all time. In place of his traditional spin dash, Sonic's new homing attack is a great way to bound between enemies in order to cover more distance without sacrificing momentum. Once Sonic collects the Lightspeed shoes, he can also dash through a trail of rings in order to reach new areas or simply collect them faster. Even without considering the booster-to-booster hallway segments, Sonic was truly one of the fastest platforming protagonists at this time, and many of this game's other playable characters weren't far behind. Everyone was only just starting to become comfortable with controlling characters with joysticks instead of directional pads. So, most popular characters, from Crash to Banjo, would waddle around much more slowly than Sonic's natural running pace. Coupling this with a smoother-than-average frame rate thanks to the Dreamcast, Sega fans were still able to experience the speeds they enjoyed with earlier Sonic titles, albeit in quite a different format. The first unlockable character to become available to players would be none other than Sonic's typical number 2, Tails, who unfortunately went vastly underutilized in this title. I feel as though Tails would have been better suited for Rayman 2 style precision platforming rather than racing segments. But it is still fun to find shortcuts that only he can access by flying, and feel like you're breaking the boundaries of the level a bit. The Sky Chase stages, directly inspired by Sega's Panzer Dragoon series for the Sega Saturn, are honestly awful levels, without exaggeration. Everything in these stages is included just for show, and each level can be completed with virtually zero input from the player. The next character wound up developing quite a bit of a cult following as the favorite 3D Sonic character, and that would be Knuckles the Echidna. The gameplay experienced when playing as Knuckles is vastly different from either Tails or Sonic, and is actually heavily reminiscent of his exploration-based roots in Sonic & Knuckles on the Genesis. While playing as the Red Echidna and defender of the Master Emerald, Players will have to utilize a hot and cold radar system in order to find emerald fragments hidden in enemies or destructible objects. Amy Rose, previously known as Princess Sally, received a more concrete update to her name, personality, and design following her ambiguous origins in the Sonic manga and Sonic CD. Amy's stages are generally just escape missions, but her large hammer is notable simply because most characters in the Sonic games don't use weapons, so her melee combat keeps things a little more interesting while she avoids her pursuer. I also think Amy's voice actress did a fantastic job in introducing a bit more personality to the character, which has stayed pretty consistent throughout subsequent media. After Amy, we finally reach the two newest characters, who in my opinion are each one of the greatest and worst introductions to the Sonic gaming franchise. Big the Cat, voiced by Duke Nukem's voice actor John St. John, contributes virtually nothing to this game's experience, and hinders the player's progress towards the game's true ending. His stages are just fishing simulators, and it feels like everything about his gameplay goes against every feature of the Sonic attitude in the first few games. He moves slowly, he's not very smart or cool, and exploration with him is kept to a bare minimum. It's even difficult to walk up gentle slopes as Big. One of his only notable mechanics, the ability to walk along the bottom of bodies of water, has several issues in regards to the camera, sense of direction, and the fact that the same button is used for both jumping and diving for some reason. It's no wonder that it feels as though his campaign doesn't contribute to the overall story, because Big was designed simply due to the fact that Sonic Team had already developed a working fishing rod in-game with no context or use. On the other hand, I actually did enjoy the gameplay of E102 Gamma's campaign, in which the player shoots enemies and obstacles to gain more time for them to reach their destination. It's also nice to play as an antagonist with more insight into Dr. Robotnik's plans, but his stages are extremely short and don't stand well on their own without relying on the fact that the player has probably played at least one of, if not all of the other characters' campaigns, so that they know how to get from point to point quickly. In contrast to Big the Cat, E102 Gamma is actually a well-written addition to the anti-hero side of the Sonic universe, with well-constructed gameplay, though like Tails, vastly underutilized. Now that we've covered all of the various characters and what they each bring to the table, let's look a bit more at this game's world, which no matter who you play as, was an undeniable technical feat of 1998. While it doesn't mesh with the gameplay quite like the 2D games did, the level design in Sonic Adventure is still phenomenal. The city of Station Square is really fun to just look at, walk around, and enjoy the liveliness of. In comparison to even very well-designed settings like Hyrule Market Square in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, the city we find ourselves in during Sonic Adventure actually feels like an advanced virtual hub, rather than a place where levels are selected and NPCs wander back and forth. You can talk to characters in the world for directions around town, or to learn about certain game mechanics, as you would in an RPG. Several of the tropical or forested areas were inspired by Central American locations, such as temples and jungles that the developers had visited in Peru and Guatemala. Multiple photos from these trips were actually used as in-game textures, a novel feature of the Dreamcast's visual capabilities. The egg carrier stages, including those that take place both indoors and outdoors, are of an unbelievably large scope for this era of gaming. The environments are massive, every texture is highly detailed, and there are interesting and understandable means of traversing these stages without being locked in a hallway or losing your sense of direction. The constantly shifting sense of gravity in these particular stages is also well ahead of its time. The Lost World stage in Sonic's campaign is probably the best level in the game. It features some interesting uses of platforming, as well as the most opportunities to actually enjoy the speed of both Sonic and the Dreamcast. There are even minor puzzles involving water and light that each break up said fast moments to actually provide engaging gameplay. They even have a gravity-changing puzzle where you can walk on certain walls. The classic Sonic games had some of the most creative boss fights in gaming history, so it was disappointing to see Sonic Adventure follow the Nintendo school of design for boss fights, with the whole dodge and hit, repeat 3 times sort of format. Luckily, virtually every playable character has a well-designed final boss fight at the end of their campaign, incorporating their unique style of gameplay. Sonic Adventure was the first project in which Jun Senue was lead composer and sound designer. Having previously worked on Sonic 3 and a few other Sega titles, Sonue introduced a new hard rock-inspired sound to Sonic's experience, which would wind up becoming an iconic soundtrack in the history of gaming, as well as a staple of the Sonic franchise for the rest of its existence thus far. The songs used in each character's credit sequences are tragically stuck in the 90s, but it's fun that they made an original song for each character. The audio quality itself is exceptional, and was certainly head and shoulders above what you could find on the N64 or PlayStation at this time. Sonic Adventure even features idle dialogue, which would become a staple in most light-hearted video games whenever a player sets their controller down for a noticeable amount of time. Sonic Adventure actually turned out to be a much better candidate for this channel than anticipated, because it actually encapsulates a lot of the questions that formed the idea of What's So Great About Gaming several years ago. Questions like, is this game worth my time? How well has it aged? Why did it matter when it came out? Or even, I've heard accounts of both what's good and bad about this game, which is true, because in this case, both are true. There are some incredible concepts introduced in this game, not only for the Sonic series, but for the world of 3D gaming at the time. However, it has also aged poorly, which wasn't helped by multiple subpar ports to later generations of hardware, which only exposed subsequent audiences to lower frame rates, numerous glitches, and lackluster updates to the game's visuals. However, when picking apart the original version of the game for Dreamcast, it's clear that Sega and Sonic Team were really trying out some ideas with little to no evidence of how it would work in a 3D space, or in the context of a Sonic adventure. And those ideas may have missed the mark, but you can clearly tell what they were going for. If nothing else, this game serves as a great experiment in which gamers, critics, and designers can easily pinpoint what did and did not work in Sonic's transition to a new dimension, though these mechanical quirks often cause little more than temporary confusion or even laughable circumstances. I think what I've come to discover about this game is that it's one of those instances of a game that's just fun to play, even recognizing all of its faults in retrospect. While playing through, I was surprised by how much I wanted to come back to it between sessions. It's not as though buggy or downright broken games can't still be loved by the masses to this day, if studios like Bethesda are meant to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, Sonic Adventure, especially its original version on the Dreamcast, doesn't even come close to those sorts of weird game-breaking cases. A couple of its biggest sins would just be that it looks goofy by today's standards, and lacks some quality of life features that really would have sold the whole experience. You have to hand it to Sega and Sonic Team for attempting a game as monstrously ambitious as Sonic Adventure in 1998. No matter the genre, whether platformer or adventure, the majority of gaming franchises made their transition from 2D to 3D during this era, and while some managed it with more grace than others, no one had an easy time of it. Visually and mechanically speaking, Sonic Adventure was well ahead of its time, especially with the consideration that Nintendo and Sony were still on their previous generation of consoles. As usual, Sonic was once again the fastest, coolest thing around, even if for a blink in the history of gaming. That is what's so great about Sonic Adventure. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we complimented and critiqued Sonic Adventure. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Super Mario 64, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.